going to dive right into Scripture because we've got a lot of ground to cover, a ton of ground. So here we go. Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 45, says this. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of Christ to Bethsaida. I don't know why I'm saying Bethesda. I'm in video game mode right now. To Bethsaida, while Jesus dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, Jesus went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land, and saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly after dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake, and was about to pass by them. But when they saw Jesus walking on the lake, they thought Christ was a ghost, and they cried out because they all saw Jesus and were terrified. I'd probably freak out too. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves and the fish. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard Jesus was. And wherever Jesus went into villages, towns, or the countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged Jesus to let them touch even the edge. So this is what we do here if you're new. This is not just about me rambling on and like 20% of the audience pretending to be interested. This is about conversation. This is about you having input and you talking about your observations. So I want you to take a moment with the people around you and talk about y'all's observations in the text. And then in a couple minutes, we're going to bring it back and we're going to share those observations with one another. So before we get into like contextual stuff, does anybody have anything they would like to share about this passage? Yes.
It speaks about touching Jesus' cloak to get people healed.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's thinking about not his physical cloak, but more of a spiritual belief, how you believe in him, how what he represents, and your faith in him will heal you. Not necessarily physically, but emotionally and spiritually.
Good stuff. Good stuff. What else? Yes.
Our table had a lot to say about the miraculous events taking place and about miracles. And, you know, I thought that it was like a metaphor for having hope in the face of despair. And our Gnostic Christian here was thinking about how to scientifically explain the miraculous, and then our, what do you call yourself? Atheistic Christian here was saying, you know, he just dismisses the miracles out of hand. But just the whole notion that we were all taken by how we deal with miracles that present in the Bible.
Very good. And I love that, you know, there's some denominational texts that take the miracles literally and some take it metaphorically. And for me, it's like whether it happened or not isn't as relevant as like the symbolism in the story. The symbolism is what's really powerful. So I'm kind of there with you. What else we got? Anything else? Yes.
To bring an interfaith dialogue into this.
Yes.
There's a prominent and great Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, that you know, if anybody knows anything at all about Christianity, they kind of know this story. That Jesus is rumored to have walked on water. And Thich Nhat Hanh takes that and says, the miracle isn't to walk on water. The real miracle is to walk on the earth with integrity.
Ooh, good one. I like it.
And I've always resonated with that particular, in a time of the greatest mass extinction since the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, climate change, etc. That message, you know, resonates a lot with me.
That's a good one. That's a really good one. One more. Who's feeling up to sharing? Eric, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead, bud.
It's kind of just a little thing about how you were talking about where David lived in the water,
Mm-hmm.
and then just Jesus walking among them,
Mm-hmm.
something that frightens them.
Mm-hmm.
And Yeah, that's all I can see.
No, that was good, and you actually stole one of my points. Good job. Gold star. Gold star. So the first thing that we need to point out here is that Jesus is so extra with this entrance. Like, nobody makes an entrance like Jesus or Freddie Mercury. Like, there is, I don't think throughout history there is no greater entrance. And, one thing that stands out to me is the significance of this passage isn't necessarily in the literal miracle. It's in those symbolic undertones of the story. Now, Eric's already pointed out that Hebrews believed that demons lived inside large bodies of waters. Ancient Hebrews did. And Jesus walking on the water, even though people are afraid of those spaces, is symbolic of Jesus not only having power over evil, but Jesus having the courage to declare authority over evil principalities. Which means if this narrative is symbolic, who did not have power over dark forces in the story of the characters that are there? You can jump in. You can chime in. Who did not have the power?
Disciples.
The disciples did not. Very good. Another gold star. And there's a clue toward the end of the story that explains why that is. It says, "For they did not understand about the loaves, and that their hearts were hardened." Now, we read about the loaves and the fish a couple weeks ago. Now, the short version, the shortest I can give, of that week's sermon is that we covered both accounts in the Gospels of the feeding of the multitudes. There's the feeding of the 5,000, and there's the feeding of the 4,000. There's two separate accounts in the Gospels. And we talk about how the numbers in those stories were symbolic of the tribes of Israel in the feeding of the 5,000, and the number 7 for the 7 loaves and the feeding of the 4,000 was symbolic to the 7 sages that Roman culture would have had a great deal of respect for. This story was a metaphor for God being on a mission to unify all peoples and to end all suffering from unjust institution. But there was another message in that story, and it's this: when Jesus fed thousands of people, many Greek scholars believe that the words present indicate that Jesus started dividing the resources they had. So they took the loaves and the fish that were brought forward, and that encouraged others to bring forth their resources. And in this moment of mass sharing, everyone's needs were filled. And not only were their needs met, they even had excess. So in the story of the loaves and fish, the message was that they did not need God to rain down manna from heaven, but rather we all must pull together our resources, and that is the miracle. Jesus was saying, you don't need me to do this for you. You can be like me. You can do what I do. Has anyone ever seen the movie Bruce Almighty? Have you ever seen it? I love that movie. I adore that movie. There's so much good progressive theology sprinkled throughout that movie. And one of the things I love was a quote that God said to Bruce. Morgan Freeman said to Bruce. And by the way, if God had a voice, I think it would have to be Morgan Freeman's. And or James Earl Jones. Maybe Liam Neeson, or Sam Elliott, all those four just have great voices. But God looks at Bruce and says, that's the problem with humanity. Everyone's looking up and no one's looking around. Everyone's looking for God to fix things and no one's looking for opportunities to meet needs. Love that quote. Now, a few weeks prior to this story, we also read in Mark chapter 4 that Jesus calmed a storm while they were in the boat in the sea. Do you remember that story? Now, again, these are symbolic stories, and this, again, was symbolic that Jesus was teaching that the way of Christ and the teachings about Christ's morality were superior to the institution of religion and empirical rule dominating their world. And Jesus calms the seas and then asks why the disciples had no faith. Now, at this point in the story, Jesus does what every good teacher does. So Jesus has calmed the seas. Jesus has fed the multitudes and basically shown the disciples that they can do what Jesus does. So Jesus lets the disciples try to do what Christ did. And they get to try to be like their rabbi. This was like a Jedi moment, and just over the cliff, Jesus was watching the boat full of Padawans. And if you thought you were going to get out of this week's sermon without a nerd reference, I'm sorry. It's not how I roll, never. So the disciples, they come up against the waves, they struggle with the oars, and they become afraid. So afraid that they didn't even recognize Jesus as Jesus was approaching. Their adrenaline was just up in the story. They thought Jesus was a ghost. And Jesus rescues them and then talks about how their hearts were hardened. They missed the point about the loaves and about the tempest that Jesus had been trying to get through to these knuckleheads. And that point is this: they are capable of being a miracle here and now. They were able to be like their rabbi and do something miraculous. Now, question, and you can, again, answer. What, or who, I should say, is missing from this story that is present in the other Gospels? Who's missing? There's one particular character that's not singled out. I guess they're there, but they're not mentioned. Peter. Peter is missing in this story. Now, in the story, in the other Gospels, Peter is invited to walk on the water with Jesus. And the text says that Peter looks down and begins to experience doubt and fear. And the story says that Peter begins to sink and drown and calls out for Jesus to rescue him. And Jesus rescues Peter and says, "Peter, you of little faith." Now, I always thought that Peter must be doubting the power of Christ. And a lot of us that have been in church before and heard this story from the pulpit have probably heard the same thing, right? I always thought that Jesus was the one being doubted, but that's not what happens. They saw Jesus walking on the water. They thought Christ was a ghost, and when they realized it was Christ, they couldn't deny the power of Christ. It's undeniable in that moment. So who was Peter doubting?
So,
Peter was doubting Peter. He was doubting himself. The disciples doubted that they could be like their rabbi. They doubted that they could meet needs and heal people of their ailments and conquer obstacles and challenge authority like Jesus did. And that makes sense because the disciples were selected. They were kind of the JV. They were the B team. Remember, none of them finished the proper education to actually formally become disciples. They were the not good enoughs, and Jesus intentionally selected them because society didn't. That's why they were fishermen and tax collectors and things like that. So the end of this passage is actually a bit tragic. Like, we look at it like, oh, there's another miracle. Christ is healing all of these sick people. But that's not the way I read this, with the symbolism of Jesus trying to get through to these people that they can be like Christ in the world. They can be the miracle that people need. It's tragic at the end. When they arrive at their destination, and people start bringing out the sick and bringing out people that are burdened and people that have been oppressed to meet Christ. And then Jesus has to be the one to heal them. Jesus has to be the one to do these miraculous things, not the disciples. My point is this: our whole lives, we are taught from birth until, death, that the most important thing you can do as a Christian is to believe in the power of God. But the message of the gospel, the good news of Jesus, is that God believes in you. God believes in us. And if we look at the resources that we have at our disposal, we can shake the foundations of this world. We can heal people that are suffering, and we can dismantle tyrant rulers that never should have been installed into power in the first place, and we can fracture corrupt kingdoms. The good news of the gospel is that we are the good news. We are the miracle the world has been praying for. And it's not only time for us to believe it, It is time for us to act like it. Amen? All right, so I want y'all to talk about how we're going to apply the scripture today. In my mind, it's one of the most powerful, narratives in the gospel, and we'll come back and we'll share application. So you talked observation before, but now talk how you're going to apply this with everything that was discussed today. And we'll be right back and share those things as well. All right, so what do we talk about? Who wants to share? Eric's. All right. You've been volunteered, Eric's. Whether you want to or not.
We had a very interesting discussion, but one thing that I initially wanted to that was a concern was just what may be going on in people's minds when hearing, the things that you were doing and saying was that hopefully nobody just latched onto the idea that, problems that we need to tackle started in 2016. Because institution doesn't happen overnight. Removing one person doesn't really change everything. It does provide immediate relief to everybody that needs it though, and to stop the current actions. But like you were saying, those fractured kingdoms, we are living in a fractured kingdom. A kingdom that was never really meant, to serve everybody. The other thing was when talking about VanHall from Texas, right? A lot of people have faith in that individual, but that reminds me of putting in faith in just Jesus and not, and doubting yourself. Because we are all capable of, maybe not all at the right time or currently, but there's definitely faith that you can put in yourself and other people that aren't, those who are fixated on elections or whatever.
Self-care is important too. I'm not going to help anybody if you don't take care of yourself, but don't stop fighting. The thing that I realized yesterday, I was at an anti-racism training that we're required to do. I'm very proud of that fact that our denomination takes not just being non-racist, but being anti-racist so seriously that it's actually required for me every year to go to anti-racist training classes. And at one point in the discussion, our teacher pointed out that, racism, capitalism, and all these negative isms that we have in the world, they're so embedded in the culture that they're not likely, not that they won't, and I don't want to defuse any hope in the room, but they're not likely to end in our lifetime. But we can do the work to make sure that future generations don't have to live in that reality. And we should do that work. And one of the symbols on our logo, the reason why Kristen picked it, is a monarch butterfly. And the interesting thing about monarchs is they actually don't live to see the end of their journey. They make this massive journey and they die along the way so that their butterfly people can survive, they can thrive, and they can continue to live. So just because we may not see the end of these things doesn't mean we shouldn't take the journey. It actually means we absolutely should. What else we got? Yes?
So I don't know if it's a little less related to scripture, but more of a responsibility for teaching. Driving here, I was actually just thinking about this idea that the work of dismantling structural racism or misogyny or all of these isms is never really done, right? It's never going to end because it's in us and replicated. So there's something very disheartening about that, but it's also been something very liberating about it because you sort of realize that we often think about sort of being justice-oriented about the end game. The day where you arrive at that place where everything is just or everything is whatever that point is, and we're always aiming at it. But it occurred to me that if there's any analog between just your own individual growth as a person and what we see in society, the point is less about decimation and more about the process. So part of this natural injustice is sort of being comfortable with this process of constant engagement, even in the face of knowing that it's in a way a losing battle. Because that's the point. That's the growth, that's the transformation, and that's what the miracle happens. And I was actually thinking about something you said last service where you're like, when I was 26, I was such a
Piece of shit, that was.
Right. But I was thinking about where was I when I was 26, and I realized that in some ways we're all little pieces of that, right? Somebody said, we all have a little Trump inside of us. That's the point. Part of dismantling we recognize from Scripture are things that shouldn't be in the world. And it is really kind of turning it on yourself too, right? That's part of it. It's like this constant examination of how do I engage in this process and transform myself as you're going, so that, for example, I've been thinking a lot about, there's so many contradictory, I'm sorry, it's going to
You're good.
You guys, I never get to have these conversations in church. I'm like,
That's why we're here. This is why we exist. Keep going. This is good.
sorry. A lot about, like, here in church, one of the dark things about Scripture is that there's always an instant of conflict, right? So we see these moments where Jesus is like, throwing over tables, and like, especially my personality, I'm like, oh Jesus, like, also these moments were legit, but Jesus doesn't do that, right? Like, he's also very loving and very much turned the other cheek and praying while he's on the cross, right? Be like, Jesus, like, God, kill them all. And he's like, go forgive them. So there is a moment where, like, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to speak truth to power and just like call it a racist, when I see them? Or am I supposed to like be loving and kind and understanding too, or in the process of growing a hard time too? Right? That's what is it? And I realized it reminded me of this concept I learned a while ago about adaptive leadership. This idea that there's different styles of leaderships where some people are like very like, what's the word? Very hierarchical and just kind of tell you what to do. And then there are people who are very much more diffused, right? It's all about collaborative work. And then we all have a tendency and style, but at the end of the day, good leadership is not about perfecting any one style, but understanding which context, what is required of you in that context, and being able to understand when I need to be more collaborative and when I need to get the heck out of the building because it's burning, right? And I think that's what Christianity is, right? It's this process of having to trust that our faith is that process of learning. When do I say Trump is just available? And when do I listen to somebody and go, I can see your fear and why you might feel that people like me are doing this to this country, right? And being able to be okay with just being loving in that space for so many to see it. I think that there's something about all of this mess that's really just about helping us to grow and understand that it's just that process. It's knowing.
No, you're good. No, this is good. And Eric, you had your hand up too, so I know you wanted to be there. Yes, very much so. Eric, what you got?
There was this one quote I had during like my education training for to be a teacher was that you may not reach every person, but that doesn't mean every person isn't going to be reached. And we do have we're all in different places in our lives, and we all have a different capacity for things. Some people are burnt out, and others are ready to take up the mantle. And there is this thing about I think what you were saying is love, right? There's being civil doesn't mean you're being loving, especially if somebody is not learning and perpetuating patterns or beliefs that are, tolerant of others or that put others in danger. But Jesus, walking on the water, walking among the demons and putting themselves in these places. Not everybody is going to be ready to do that. Not everybody needs to, because we all have a role to play in dismantling systems of oppression. But if you do have that capacity and you do have that willingness, then if anything, what the whole thing about Peter doubting himself is don't doubt yourself. You are capable, and maybe sometimes you'll need to take a step back. You won't always have to call it out. Somebody else might do it too. But I think it will, the sharing, people bringing in their resources. If you do it, others would be inspired to do it.
Good stuff. And as you all know, we all have different approaches to leadership. Mine tends to be a little soft, very passive and loving and not direct. I'm just kidding. I was like, did I just use sarcasm effectively? I've never done that before. All right, so for me, I think there is wisdom in reading the room in your audience. Some folks can respond to logic. A lot of people don't, but it's paradoxical because you can't have tolerance if you tolerate intolerance. The disciples, we have a saying that says all means all. But if you have people in the community that don't believe all means all, catering to them is, you're working against yourself. So the inspiration that I see from Jesus is Jesus, had different methodology in different spaces and in talking to different people. Sometimes Jesus was a little more loving and logical. Sometimes especially with leadership, especially with power, Jesus did not hold back with power. Jesus seemed to hold back more with citizens that were oppressed and kind of lovingly coach them along. People that were oppressed by the system, but maybe defending it in some way. But when power was involved, Jesus was direct. Jesus did not hold back. And I think speaking loving truth to power is what I see Jesus do. Jesus wasn't necessarily civil, but Jesus wasn't violent either. And there's the space in between violent revolution and nonviolent subversion. And Jesus kind of teetered more toward nonviolence. But Jesus absolutely wasn't civil either when Jesus didn't need to be. And that's the space where Christians need to wrestle right now. I'm literally having this argument on my Facebook page about why white Christians think they should be able to use the N-word. As a matter of fact, I pointed out that Jesus spoke out against, oppressive views and things like that. And they were like, well, I don't care what Jesus does. I think it's wrong that you're doing this because you're a pastor. I'm like, I'm a Christian pastor. I teach people to be like Jesus, and Jesus did this. You're not making any sense. But it's wild. But I want to encourage white people in the room, people with privilege, especially. If you have privilege, it's going to be hard some days to get out there and fight the fight. But you need to work your ass off to end privilege. And to do that, you got to use that privilege. That's the other paradox too. Okay, I know it's hard. I know it's difficult. And it's frustrating when people don't listen. But it's our responsibility because, let's be honest, our ancestors created this mess we're in. We're responsible to fix it. Amen? Amen. So for me, this passage spoke volumes to me. We have this caravan of refugees heading our way. Not invaders, actual refugees. And then there's the NorCal fires, right? And by the way, y'all, Paradise, California is just a preview. It's a canary in the coal mine for the coming climate crisis. Matter of fact, I think Katrina was that preview, but we didn't recognize it. And Republicans and evangelicals that are just constantly denying the reality, the scientific evidence of climate change. If you were in a coal mine, when the canary drops, you don't kick the canary and call it a fake bird. You don't ask it if it's paid by George Soros, and you damn sure don't accuse it of having an agenda. You get out of the coal mine. GTFO. But I digress. But it's a frustrating thing. But California, this season has looked like a preview for a new Mad Max movie. It's just on fire. And then we had another mass shooting occur this week, and it was from a veteran, and we're approaching Veterans Day, and that's just such a tragic reminder of how wrong our military system is, how much damage it does. And then we've got the reality that's unfortunate and toxic, but white supremacy influences a lot of this. I mean, white supremacists are mostly the mass shooters that we have in this country, and then not only do we have this instance of a tragic mass shooting, one of the victims survived the Vegas shooting. How messed up is your country that mass shootings are happening at such a consistent rate and horrific rate that citizens have been in multiple mass shootings? That's insane. And the whole you need a gun to stop it doesn't hold water because cops are dying too trying to stop these shooters. It's unreal how much is going on in this country. And then in the political spectrum, we had an election that is, from what I see, voter fraud. It's clear as day. There's voter fraud going on. There are people suppressing votes. There's gerrymandering. There's all of these things going on in America. And it breaks my heart that the people in this country that claim with their whole heart to follow Jesus feel that the only solution we have is to send up thoughts and prayers. They think that's it. That's the only answer. But the gospel teaches us in this story and many others that we don't have to pray for a miracle. In fact, I'm pretty sure God's tired of hearing the prayers. The gospel beckons us to take up the mantle of doing the miraculous. This story today teaches us that we are the answer to prayers. The divine force we call God is just sitting back, chomping at the bits to march with us, not for us, to justice, if we have the courage to walk with all the authority that Christ had against the forces of evil in this world. Dr. Martin Luther King said this, that the moral arc of the universe tips towards justice. We are responsible in taking the path and walking that arc together, boldly rising above the storms and the waves of hatred that the sea of empire is swelling all around us. We have that responsibility and that opportunity before us on a daily basis. And that's what lies before you on your tables today. There are broken pieces of bread on the table that remind us of the condition of this world. There is a cup that symbolizes the sacrifice that is absolutely required to reshape this reality into something that benefits all of humanity. And a shared meal that we partake in every week that is a reminder that we all are equal. We're all made of flesh. We all must eat and drink to sustain ourselves, and if we don't, we perish. And in this knowledge of our shared humanity, our fight for equitable treatment of all people here and afar, the abolition of oppression and poverty and systemic racism and sexism, all of these isms that are hurting our fellow humans is certainly implied in this ritual that we take every week. So people of all faith identities, atheists to atheistic Christians, agnostic Christians, Buddhists, pagans, any isms, pagans, anybody, you are welcome to take this ceremony with us if you're committed to this radical revolution of nonviolent subversion. On the night Jesus was betrayed, Jesus took bread and they broke it and said, "Take and eat, and as often as you do, I want you to do so in remembrance of what I have done and what you can do." Now I want you to take the cup at your table and begin to pass it to your neighbor, and as it comes your way, try to picture the imagery of the story. Then Jesus took the cup and they said, "This is my blood. It's a new promise that I will never leave you or forsake you as you strive to plant love, peace, unity, and justice into this fallen, broken, cracked society. Take and drink, and as often as you do so in remembrance of me, in remembrance of what I did, in remembrance of what you can do together. Do so in remembrance of this world's brokenness, in remembrance of our collective obligation to mend that brokenness. Do so, and I will be with you always. Grace and peace to you. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace, y'all. See you next week.